Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Otep, this is Femi here with Freedom Now, and your ears are in tuned at high frequencies in a liberated zone. Freedom Now is a Pan-Africanist, global news outlet from coast to coast, dispelling the Western propaganda media and their all lies point of views. Freedom Now is devoted to relay true news, views, and proper clues to form solutions around freedom for the oppressed worldwide. Now, get relaxed, grab a pen, and phone a friend, because Freedom Now is set to begin to awaken deep sleepers dreaming about Freedom Now within, in Freedom Now, in.
Habari Gani. This is Sister Thage with Freedom Now's agenda for this Saturday, November 23rd, 2024. We open this agenda in honor of the hundreds of journalists martyred around the globe this year. We commence with our sister Luyanda Kuboka and the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar. Then, this hour, prolific author, radical historian, Professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne interviews Dr. Eric McDuffie, Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana, and author of the book, The Second Battle for Africa, Garveyism, the US Heartland, and Global Black Freedom. And later in the hour, Dr. Horne interviews Dr. Adam Ewing, Associate Professor of African American Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and editor of the new book, The Essential Writings of Robert Hill. We invite all Freedom Now listeners to a pop-up children's book drive happening today, Saturday, November 23rd from 2 to 6 p.m. at the Radical Hood Library, located at 2304 West Jefferson Boulevard. That's 2304 West Jefferson Boulevard here in Los Angeles, 90018. Our sister is Matu Gwendolyn of Sierra Leone is organizing this book drive, so come help provide resources for children and adults in Sierra Leone. Early readers across all ages benefit from children's literature, as we all know. So again, the children's book drive is happening today from 2 to 6 p.m. at the Radical Hood Library, located at 2304 West Jefferson Boulevard, 90018. Our music clip mix includes MLK, Zap Mama, John Coltrane, Sonny Stitt, James Clay, John Handy, West African drumming, prison radio commentaries, and more. So sit back, phone a friend, and as always, we stand ready for revolution.
Molweni Mawetu. This is Sister Luyanda Kuboka with this week's African Drum Beat Historical Calendar. November 23rd, 1958, President Nkrumah of Ghana and Sekou Touré Prime Minister of Guinea unite the two nations to form the nucleus of the United States of Africa. President Modibo Keïta of Mali later joins the union, which is the fundamental objective of Pan-Africanism. Once Africa is united with a central government, language, economy, military, and foreign policy, African people, black people throughout Africa and the diaspora, including the United States, will have a national homeland and a base to demand and implement the elimination of racism, sexism, and class exploitation. November 23rd, 1909, tens of thousands of workers, mostly women, no longer willing to accept meager wages and degrading working conditions, went on strike against the garment industry in New York City. November 24th, 1965, the United States installs Mobutu as the neo-colonial puppet head of the Congo. Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected head of the Congo, was assassinated by a CIA-backed coup d'etat. Dominican Republic female leaders were executed. Las Hermanas Maria Teresa, Minerva, and Patria, leaders against the US-installed Trujillo dictatorship. All three were members of the June 14th movement, which led the mass movement against Trujillo. November 26, 1883, Sister Sojourner Truth, African abolitionist, human rights crusader, committed to ending class, racial, and gender oppression. In 1827, at the age of 30, she ran away from the slave plantation, dropped her slave name, Isabella Baumfree, and claimed her own name, Sojourner Truth, in response to what she described as a command from God to become a preacher and activist against slavery. November 27th, 1853, Lucy Parson, revolutionary anarchist, born a slave of Mexican, Creek, and African ancestry, fled from Texas and became a founder of the International Working People's Association, a revolutionary labor organization which led the struggle from 10 to 14 hours workdays to 8-hour workdays. She led numerous marches against the rich in the continued struggle for the redistribution of social wealth. November 28, 1960, Mauritania of Africa becomes independent. November 29, 1947, the United Nations made a decision to partition Palestine. As a result, every November 29th, Palestinians in the diaspora recognize this day as an international day of solidarity. Let's close out this week's African drumbeat calendar in the language of struggle of our people in South Africa. Amandla.
Awethu.
Amandla.
Awethu.
Amandla.
Awethu. All right.
This has been Sister Luyanda Koboka of Freedom Now.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Eric McDuffie, Associate Professor of African American Studies and History at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, author of the book, The Second Battle for Africa, Garveyism, the US Heartland, and Global Black Freedom. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Eric McDuffie.
Thank you, Dr. Horne. It's my pleasure being here.
And it's a pleasure to have you. So, why did you write this book? the Second Battle for Africa, and also tell us what was the first battle for Africa.
Sure. Well, this book, as I note, is deeply personal. I was born in Detroit, Michigan, raised in suburban Cleveland. My great grandmother hailed from St. Kitts, she migrated to Canada, Toronto, where she had my grandmother. My grandmother came down to Detroit, where she met my grandfather. And I say all this to say is that I am a sixth generation African American Midwesterner. Very, very proud to be from this part of the world. And what I'm doing is I am emphasizing the importance of the Midwest, or what I call the diasporic Midwest, to the making of 20th century Black history through Garveyism. The first battle for Africa was during the 1920s, during the height of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, co-founded by the Jamaican Black nationalists, Pan-Africanists, Marcus Garvey and Amy Ashwood Garvey. And of course, as you know, the UNIA was the largest Black movement in history, claiming as many as 6 million members globally. And during the UNIA's height in the 20s, they actively championed African self-determination, the freedom, the independence of Africa from European colonial powers. Of course, the Garvey movement was unsuccessful in overthrowing European empires in Africa during the 20s, but certainly, of course, Garveyism was foundational to African liberation, Caribbean liberation, African American freedom movements. So the second battle refers to a quote from one of my key subjects, a gentleman by the name of Reverend Clarence Harding from Chicago. He was a longtime Garveyite. His parents were Garveyites. He was born in the early 20th century. And in 1967, or rather in 1966, he moved to Liberia on the orders of the President General of the UNIA, Thomas Harvey of Philadelphia. And in this letter from Reverend Harding to Harvey, Reverend Harding said that they were going to launch and win the second battle for Africa, while the Garvey movement was unsuccessful in the 20s. In the era of the 60s and 70s, the peak of African liberation, Reverend Harding was confident that the Garvey movement would be at the forefront of African liberation.
Mm-hmm. So the Second Battle for Africa, in other words, is the successful conclusion of the anti-colonial struggles culminating with independence in places like Sudan, Ghana, forward to Nigeria, etc.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Now, we also know that you have specialized in gender studies, and we understand that in the current book, you have revelations about the family of Malcolm X. What are they?
Yes, well, women, gender, sexualities are central or critical categories of my book and of my research for the last 20 years. I focus considerably on Louise Little, who is best known as the mother of Malcolm X. But what I point out in the book is that Louise Little was a major, brilliant Pan-Africanist grassroots Garveyite activist in her own right, that she helped to instill the Black radical, Black internationalist sensibilities in all of her children, and of course, Malcolm being her most famous. She was born in Grenada. She was the product of rape. Her father was a Scot who apparently had a penchant for sexually assaulting Black African women and girls. And her mother at the time was only 11 years old. despite the fact that Louise Little could pass or was quite fair complected, she was deeply proud of being black, and she was raised in a family who was immensely proud, who valued self reliance, land ownership, independence, and her grandparents, interestingly enough, and this is part of the story that often gets ignored, not discussed in the autobiography of Malcolm X. Her grandparents, Jupiter and Mary Jane Langdon, apparently hailed from Nigeria. So it's quite interesting to think that, or to know that Brother Malcolm's family, on both sides of his family, hailed from West Africa.
So, what part of West Africa was his father's side from?
So his father's side, so that's the Little side of the family, Earl Little. Um, their ancestor was a brother by the name of Ajar. And apparently he came to this country around 1815, 1816 from the Senegambia. And according to family lore, Ajar was Muslim, as were Mary Jane Langdon and Jupiter Langdon. So on both sides of Brother Malcolm's family, you had uh, Islamic relatives, Muslim relatives.
Now, you mentioned in your opening remarks that your focus is on the Midwest of the United States. How do you define the Midwest of the United States, and why does it play such a pivotal role in your pages?
Sure. I understand the Midwest as a single yet complex region in the heartland, or what is considered the heartland of the United States. The region that we now call the Midwest consists of 12 states. I won't go through all of them, but certainly for my book, I focus considerable attention on Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri. And these states, this region was and still is the industrial heartland of this country. It was the center of capitalist uh, industrial accumulation, production. But going back in time, the Midwest, or this region that we now call the Midwest, was critical to making this country a continental empire, a key site of settler colonialism, efforts to exterminate indigenous people, of course, a transnational borderland region. So the Midwest has this mythos of being a land of meritocracy and freedom, what have you. Certainly, of course, slavery, chattel slavery, slavery did exist in the Midwest, contrary to popular belief, but certainly not to the scale in the U.S. South. So, what I argue, I call it the dialectic of opportunity and oppression. The Midwest has had this ironic, paradoxical place in African American life and history, where it was a site of unbounded opportunity, economic opportunity. Black folks could vote, while at the same time being a site of extreme racial oppression, the Ku Klux Klan, white vigilantism. Apparently, the first black person lynched in this country occurred in 1836 in St. Louis. Of course, the Dred Scott case. We can go on and on and on. But again, the importance of the Midwest as a site of oppression, but as a site of black radicalism, a site of black resistance. And it's not ironic that the events of 2020, Black Lives Matter, Ferguson, 2014, 2015, that it was in the Midwest that helped to launch the most important Black freedom movement, or Black led freedom movement in this country since the Civil Rights Black Power movement.
And your great grandfather, Arthur D. Chandler, plays a role in your book. How so?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I come from a family of teachers, preachers, Garveyites, communists, auto workers, what have you. My great grandfather, Arthur D. Chandler, on my mother's grandfather, he was a prominent preacher. He was the pastor of Second Baptist Church in Detroit, the oldest black church in the Midwest. And my great grandfather was a very, very prominent Garveyite in Detroit. In fact, when Garvey came to the city, to Detroit in 1923, my great grandfather rather introduced Mr. Garvey. So I've known for a very, very long time that I had Garveyite roots. And again, my own diasporic Midwestern family history deeply, deeply inspires the work that I do.
And what role does West Africa, particularly Ghana and Liberia, play in your pages?
Yes, so Ghana, Liberia are critical, absolutely critical to my book. As you know, Liberia and Ghana have and had very, very important places in global struggles for Black freedom, African liberation. Certainly, Liberia has always been a complex site, a place, a Black settler colony where formerly enslaved Black people from this country and to a lesser extent the Caribbean, Barbados, went to Liberia in search of freedom. And of course, what did they do? They erected a Black settler colonial state, which was in some ways as oppressive and as ruthless in its treatment of indigenes as Europeans were. But still, Black nationalists, Garvey, the Garvey movement, various movements that Garveyism inspired, looked to Liberia as a site of liberation, or as they called it, African redemption. And Ghana as well, a critically important site in African liberation and Pan-Africanism. Its founder, Kwame Nkrumah, was a Garveyite. He was quite explicit, quite unapologetic in identifying Garvey as the progenitor of African nationalism, as the person who opened Nkrumah's eyes to the struggle of Black people. And also that can be said of Nnamdi Ezekwe, the founder of Nigeria, who was also a Garveyite and credited Garvey with opening his eyes to the struggles of African people. I conducted considerable research in Ghana as well as in Liberia, where I interviewed in Liberia. I interviewed several members of or relatives, descendants of James R. Stewart and Goldie Stewart of Cleveland, Ohio. As you know, Dr. Horne, James Stewart was the successor of Marcus Garvey as President General of the UNIA. James Stewart became the second President General of the UNIA in 1940 after Mr. Garvey expired, after he passed away in London. And then in 1949, James R. Stewart, along with Goldie Stewart and their family, they emigrated to Liberia and did what Garvey was unsuccessful in doing. The Stewarts set foot on the continent of Africa. They lived in Africa, and they moved. James R. Stewart moved the headquarters of the Garvey movement from Cleveland to Liberia, fulfilling Garvey's goal of having the UNIA based in West Africa.
So another ancestor of yours was John Hatfield. I understand
Yes.
you're going to be conducting research on him. Who was he?
Yes, so he was my great grandfather. He was African American, or at least how the census at the time they designated him a so-called mulatto. But what was clear is that John Hatfield, my ancestor, very much identified with Black people. He was an abolitionist, an Underground Railroad conductor. He was a hero in Black Cincinnati due to his championing of abolition and freeing Black people from the shackles of slavery. My ancestor went to Canada, like many African Americans in search of freedom, as a strategic move as this country was heading towards the Civil War and the possible re-enslavement of free black people in any part of this country. And on the eve of the U.S. Civil War, he and his son moved, or emigrated from Canada, or rather from the States, to Australia, where they hoped to live as free and dignified people. John Hatfield died within months after his arrival, but his son Charles Hatfield survived, married an English woman, and they begat. And what's very exciting about this current book project, as you pointed out, I plan to write a biography on my great grandfather. In 2018, we held our very first family reunion of Hatfield descendants, those in Australia, the white side of the family, and then Hatfields in the States, the black side of the family. It was the first time the family had gotten together in more than 150 years. We held the family reunion at my uncle's home in Dallas, my uncle and aunt's home in Dallas, Texas.
Finally, Eric McDuffie, author of the book The Second Battle for Africa, what would you say are the areas of Garveyism and the Garvey movement that we need to know more about, that need further exploration?
Great question. I would say, first and foremost, we still need more research on Garveyite women, people like Louise Little, Henrietta Vinton Davis. We need a biography of her, of both women. And we also need to look more at the spin-offs, the offshoots of Garveyism and the UNIA. And I do some of that in my book, looking at the Nation of Islam, Moorish Science Temple, the Revolutionary Action Movement, Black religious, spiritual organizations, the fascinating way, or the way Garveyism moved in multiple ideological directions, how it inspired and influenced people, again, from across the ideological spectrum, and also to look at other places across the Black world where Garveyism flourished. So, for example, I think work could be done on Garveyism and Australia. Certainly more work on Garveyism in Brazil. The continued resonance, the continued significance of Garvey and Garveyism in shaping Black thought, Black culture, Black religions, Black resistance today.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Eric McDuffie, author of the book The Second Battle for Africa, Garveyism, the US Heartland, and Global Black Freedom. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran.
And now we go to our prison radio commentaries.
The end of empire? For years, I've studied the histories of empires, especially their rise and their fall. Europe's most illustrious example, Rome, grew from a city to a state, and finally, a world empire. When their men tired of fighting, they trained non-Romans in their war tactics. And when they were treated with contempt by Romans, they responded by sacking the city and stealing their treasure before leaving. It wasn't the end of Rome, but it was a signal of the beginning of the end. Empires rise and empires fall. That is a lesson of history. A century ago, Britain boasted that the sun would never set on the British Empire. A few world wars later, and after decolonization struggles, and it is an empire no more. Its recent Brexit episode has cleaved its economic strength, and most foreign observers see it as a self-inflicted wound. It shows us that great empires can succumb to a kind of suicide. Now, what of the American empire? Is it immune to the lessons of history? Half a century ago, it lost a war to a poor Asian nation. After it inflicted millions of casualties upon them. The country that won the war was called Vietnam. Just days ago, it elected an immoral man whose only real claim to fame was his bank account. Because of this election, America has no voice with which to tell other countries how to elect their leaders. It has no voice in questions of morality. It has great power, yes, but that didn't win in Vietnam, nor in Afghanistan, where they simply outweighted the Americans. Empires are not immortal. They may last for centuries, yes, but ultimately they rise and they fall. With love, not fear. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
Hi, my name is Crystal Clark. My inmate number is 435064. I know everybody know who I am. I'm in WHV, the Valley of Death. Gives me help. I'm just trying to survive in the Valley of Death. They are really, really killing me in here. Like, this is unstoppable. I saw Dr. Ellison, the man who's been lying about my health, saying nothing that's wrong. Don Jones, Dr. Ellison, they all been lying. Not truthful. Saw Dr. Robert Lacey on the 28th. I was telling y'all he was just driving me the medicine I had for the fungus mold for 84 days. I have to take for 84 days. And on top of that, I have to take a antibiotic ear drops for 14 days. 4 drops, 4 times a day. Lord Jesus. Yeah, I would get emotional. But when he looked at my ears, it was totally like I wish I could be a fly on the wall to see how this man looked at. He knew right away something was wrong, and I've been crying for how long, begging for help, just begging for y'all to treat it. Y'all, it's no cure because I'm still housed in it. But to treat it and give me something, not let it get this bad in my skin and in my body. They knew what they was doing. So now I'm getting excited, like at least I'm getting something. I go over there, they tell me I have to walk out here on a walker 6 times a day. Dr. Ellison, I said who gave these orders? Dr. Ellison turned around after the head doctor and restrict my eardrops. Eardrops in the medication, that's KOPs. KOPs mean to stay in your room. You take it from your unit. said, I asked the doctor, and I looked at Dr. Ellis, and I said, why is you doing this, sir? I said, I wouldn't even have to go to a head doctor if you would have been helping me, if y'all would have been helping me. I've been telling y'all every day, crying for help and begging, and y'all been seeing it bleeding and coming out my ears and everything else. I've been asking y'all for help, and y'all did anything but made it seem like I was crazy, making me seem like, taking me to a psychiatrist, making it seem like I was crazy. It took a head doctor from Lansing to come in here to give me some medication for 84 days, then eardrops for 14 days. And now I got to walk out here. It's about to be cold ice out there on a walker, standing out there in the cold. I begged him. I said, Dr. Ellison, don't do this. I said, I've been asking you for help. I should have had to beg no doctor. He took an oath to do right. Then he should have did right by me. And he's still doing this to me. He's still retarded. He know that he can get in trouble, and he should be already in trouble for charting this and telling Lansing and on his files that I'm doing good and ain't nothing wrong with my ears and everything, and it's the head doctor from Lansing. So what is going to be done now about this? When y'all know the truth. 84 days to February, that's a long time to take that medication twice a day. Like, this is wrong. I cannot speak out. I can't say nothing about my health. I can't do anything because I'm getting retaliated. I'm not going to stop fighting for my life. They are killing me in here. So I'm asking everybody to stop in and help save a life.
These commentaries are recorded by Prison Radio.
We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
For KPFK Pacifica Radio, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Adam Ewing, Associate Professor of African American Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and editor of the new book, The Essential Writings of Robert Hill. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Adam Ewing.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So who is Robert Hill, and why did you decide to write or publish a book about him, I should say?
So Robert Hill is an emeritus professor at UCLA. He is Jamaican-born, grew up in a very politically active Jamaican family, had a really important political career as a Black Power activist in the 1960s, first in Canada, but then in Jamaica. He was one of the pioneering members of the Black Studies movement. He was a member of the Institute of the Black World Collective in Atlanta that was very important as a germinal influence on the Black Studies movement. And then he went into more formal academia, first at Northwestern, then at UCLA. He is most famous as the editor of the Marcus Garvey and UNIA Papers Project, which is, it's hard to overstate the significance of that work. And in addition to a number of other really important edited volumes, it's because of that work that I first became acquainted with Hill. I was a graduate student looking for a project, and I decided to study the Garvey movement, and particularly Garveyism as a social movement and a social process. And I was amazed by what Hill had accomplished. And so part of this effort is to foreground a scholar that was incredibly important in my own intellectual genealogy. And more than that, I think made it possible to do the type of work that I did as a researcher of Garveyism, and the work that many other people did as a result of his monumental work of archival collection, of editing, making these documents accessible that had simply accessible before. But the other reason is that even though Hill has a really distinguished career as a writer and as a thinker of Garveyism and Pan-Africanism, he never published a single author monograph. He published dozens of books as an editor. He's written a number of essays in those books and in journals and scattered around. But because he became so engrossed in that work as an editor, he never published a single author book. And I thought that it was appropriate, given the influence that he has had as a thinker on Garveyism and Pan-Africanism that a single volume be created to collect his work so that his work can be recognized and appreciated by more people.
Now, for those who may be new to the subject, perhaps you could digress for a moment on the importance of Marcus Garvey and the movement he initiated. Fellow Jamaican, for example. Talk to us about Marcus Garvey for a moment or two.
Yeah, Garvey was an incredibly influential figure that for many years was sort of understudied and underappreciated in the sort of mainstream American academy. Garvey grew up in the tradition of Pan-Africanism in Jamaica, which had a really active tradition of resistance, what the theorist Sylvia Wynter calls the politics of the plot, against the sort of the structure of European imperialism typified by the plantation. Garvey was able to catalyze this popular Pan-Africanism, this desire by Jamaicans to build autonomous structures outside the logic of the plantation, and really was able to catalyze that tradition of resistance into a global mass movement. And so starting in Jamaica, and then Garvey emigrated to the United States and really took his movement took hold in Harlem and in the United States, was able to build a mass movement committed to African liberation, to the building of Black power, to the articulation of African and Black-centered spaces, with the ultimate objective of overcoming the constraints of European imperialism.
So Robert Hill published about 10 or 11 volumes, if I'm not mistaken, on Garvey and Garveyism. Talk to us about how he collected those documents. Where do those documents come from? And what light do they shed on various continents and countries?
Right. Well, this is, I mentioned that it's hard to overstate the significance of those volumes. The Garvey papers are not simply a collection of Garvey's thoughts. They really are, as Hill imagined them, an effort to understand Garveyism as a social process. And when Hill started this work in the 80s and the late 70s, there really was no archive. Garvey's personal papers were destroyed during the firebombing of London during World War II. The papers of the organization were scattered in archives and across newspapers, and that were contained all over the world, all over Africa, in the colonial archives, in missionary archives, in African-run newspapers throughout the Caribbean and the Americas. When Hill started this work, there was important work done by Garvey's widow, Amy Jakes Garvey, by people like Tony Martin, and that had really made a case for Garvey's importance. But without the archive of those documents available, the prevailing view in the American Academy was that Garveyism had been a fleeting phenomenon, that Garvey had burst onto the scene, launched a couple of failed ventures, and then gone off the stage. What Hill did to build that archive, Hill and his collaborators, was to travel all over the world, to travel to Africa and to go into those archives and to pour through newspapers and government documents, and to really build out of nothing an archive that simply hadn't existed before. An archive that doesn't only give you a sense of what Garvey himself believed, but that shows you how Garveyism became a mass movement. Because the thing that Hill always emphasized about Garveyism is that Garveyism was a social process. It was a part of identity and community and political formation among Black people in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And what happened when Garvey's message traveled around the world is that it took root and catalyzed local struggles and local ideas and politics in the making in diverse and far-flung places, whether it was in on the plantations of European farms in the colonies in Africa, or in the mines, or in the banana plantations of the United Fruit Company, whether it was in the US South. Everywhere Garveyism traveled, it was translated. And Hill's volumes are able to show that to show Garveyism not only as the man himself imagined it, but how Garveyism itself was transformed into a living anti-colonial politics in all of these different places. It's truly remarkable. So in the introduction to the volume, I say that that Hill himself really needs to be thought of among the likes of Arturo Schomburg, the man whose vast collection of artifacts and materials from the African diaspora in Africa became the basis for the Schomburg Center when he passed away and his collection was purchased by the New York Public Library. Hill's legacy as an archivist of Black memory, preserving the counter-memory of Black radical history, really deserves to be recognized as a remarkable achievement.
Now, we already knew about the Negro World, which was the publication of the Garvey movement. And of course, there are many excerpts from the Negro World in these multiple volumes. But what I found striking about the Marcus Garvey papers edited by Robert Hill were the numerous reports from various intelligence agencies, particularly from the Western European powers and the United States, and it becomes impossible to dismiss the Garvey movement when one recognizes the rapt attention paid to this movement by our mutual antagonists. Perhaps you could digress about that for a moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The very first book that was published about Garveyism was written by Amy Jakes Garvey, called Garvey and Garveyism. And in that volume, Jakes Garvey talked about the way in which, if you want to understand the significance of Garveyism, look in the colonial archives of Britain and France, and you will see the fear that was engendered by the Garvey movement as evidence of the enduring importance and simply reach of the Garvey movement. And, again, like that perspective was dismissed for many years. The first academic book written about Garveyism was written by a guy named David Cronin, and he dismissed Amy Jakes Garvey's book as a, quote, book of reminiscence. But what we have discovered and what Hill makes clear and what is very clear in the Garvey papers is exactly what Jakes Garvey suggested, that if you look in the colonial archive, you don't only see the fear that was engendered by colonial officials, the fear that was engendered by American officials, the fear that was engendered by authorities in the British Caribbean and in Central America. You also see evidence of Garveyism's remarkable penetration and influence despite efforts to block the spread of Garveyite ideology. So the Negro world was banned throughout most of Africa. There were preliminary attempts to block its spread in the Caribbean and Central America until authorities realized it was impossible. And yet, because colonial authorities and US authorities were so attuned to and watching the spread of Garveyism, because they had informants in the movement, they were able to actually see how Garveyite agents were getting into these places. They were traveling up and down the coast of West Africa. They were smuggling papers of the Negro world on ships folded into other newspapers. There's a very famous story of that Jomo Kenyatta, the first president of Kenya, told CLR James, where he said, "Look, when I was a young man, in growing up in Kenya, we would smuggle these newspapers of the Negro world into Kenya, and one person would read Garvey's front page editorial a few times so that we could remember it, and then we would spread out through the country, spreading the word of the movement, and sort of building from that." So I think it's a good point that the papers really do highlight just how keen the attention was on Garvey and just how much of a threat Garveyism was perceived of by colonial authorities, by US authorities.
So you just mentioned CLR James, the late Trinidadian intellectual and activist, author of the pioneering book on the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, which really needs to be studied even today, even though it was published almost 90 odd years ago. And my understanding is that Robert Hill, still in the land of the living, is now working on the papers of C.R.R. James. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, Robert Hill became a mentee of C.L.R. James. They had a long friendship. C.L.R. James spent a time living with Robert Hill in Canada when Hill was a student in Canada. And in the same way that I think Hill remains the most thoughtful scholar writing on Garveyism and thinking about the importance of Garveyism, I think he remains the preeminent thinker on C.L.R. James. And that's in part because of the work that he has done in building a C.L.R. James archive alongside the Garvey archive. Hill tracked down the unpublished manuscript that became Notes on Dialectics that James later said was his most important work. They had this long relationship, but Hill was also deeply influenced by James's approach to Marxism and James's approach to writing. And in many ways, I think what you see in the volume in these essays by Hill is an example of a Jamesian forms of history coming to life, a continuation of the work that James was doing during his life.
Now, Adam Ewing, you are also the author of a leading book on Marcus Garvey. Talk to us about your contribution to Garvey studies and what influence, if any, Robert Hill had on your trajectory.
Yeah, well, I don't think it can be overstated. I don't think that for any scholars thinking about or working on Garveyism in my generation, the contribution of Hill can be overstated. I think that, in the most basic sense, access to the Garvey papers made it possible for my generation of scholars to push even further. I mean, it remains the case that as much as Hill has been able to uncover about the Garvey movement, and as much as other scholars have been able to uncover about the reach and the influence of the Garvey movement, we're still behind. We still don't have a full understanding of just how far and how widely Garveyism penetrated. I think we're also behind in another sense, which is that for many years in the US Academy, Garveyism and the strain of politics that Garveyism represented simply wasn't taken seriously. It was taken seriously in Black studies, but it was really marginalized in history. And there's a whole story about how the integration of the American historical profession in the 1960s, for the first time really started significantly recognizing the idea that Black people make history, but did so in a way that was very circumscribed and that really elided and obscured the influence of Black nationalism and the type of Pan-Africanism that Garveyism represented. So I see myself as following in the footsteps of what Hill has been trying to do for several decades, which is to actually explain why Garveyism is so important as a political force, why Garveyism mattered so much for so many people throughout the African diaspora, why when we're thinking about the Black radical tradition, we cannot really do so without understanding the importance of the strain of politics that Garveyism was a crucial component of. I very much see myself as working within the tradition that Hill laid out for me and laid out for other scholars. I also really think that Hill's emphasis on thinking through Garveyism as a social process, rather than understanding Garveyism as a movement that really stems from the politics and biography of Marcus Garvey, was incredibly influential in my own work and really provided the basis for my argument in The Age of Garvey, which looks at the way in which Garveyism's thought became the vehicle for politics making in Central Africa and in East Africa and in other places in ways that Garvey himself could not have imagined, but that remained captured within this broad tradition of Pan-Africanism that Garvey was one of the most famous articulators of, but by no means the only force for generating.
And of course, your book is entitled The Age of Garvey, How a Jamaican Activist Created a Mass Movement and Changed Global Politics, which brings us to our final question. Adam Ewing, editor of the book The Essential Writings of Robert Hill. Considering the multiple volumes published by Robert Hill on the Garvey movement, what are the avenues for study of this movement that still need to be explored? I mean, for example, we know that of late there has been further exploration of Garveyism and gender, for example.
Mm-hmm.
There has obviously been exploration of Garveyism in the United States, to a degree, Garveyism in Africa. Are there any other avenues that a younger scholar or thinker might consider pursuing?
Absolutely. Well, Brenda Gale Plummer, the great historian, has suggested that much could be learned by really digging into the influence of Garveyism in Brazil.
Mm-hmm.
I would be fascinated to see what a young scholar might find. Another scholar of Garveyism that's done really important work on exploring the gendered aspects of Garveyism, Natanya Duncan, has suggested to me once, boy, there's a lot to dig into in looking at the manifestations of Garveyism in Europe. There still remains a lot of work to do to chart the influence of Garveyism in Africa as well. In the age of Garvey, I look at the way in which Garveyism spread and manifested in Zambia, Malawi, and Kenya. I think, and there are scholars that have done work in South Africa, in West Africa, but even I'm working on a project that's looking at Ghana right now, and have been amazed to see how many documents I've uncovered that suggest a far deeper influence of Garveyism in the articulation of a politics in the colonial Gold Coast than I had anticipated. I was shocked to sort of come to the realization that Kwame Nkrumah's politics was far more shaped by Garvey's style of politics than I had previously understood. I think it remains the case that because Garveyism represented the form of politics making and grew out of a tradition of Pan-Africanism that had a real resonance across the African diaspora and in Africa itself, a politics that was fundamentally rooted in the preservation of African autonomy, in the preservation of African institutions, or in the rearticulation of Black-centered space, that Garvey's influence became useful for politics wherever Black people were. And not, like I said, not necessarily in ways that Garvey could have anticipated, but it provided the fodder for the articulation of an anti-colonial politics that if we sort of follow the geography of Garveyism, we can really learn a lot about Black politics during the period of Garveyism and about just how diverse and dynamic Garveyism was as a social movement.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Adam Ewing, editor of the book, The Essential Writings of Robert Hill, longtime UCLA professor. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Great to be here.
And in closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Erik McDuffie, Dr. Adam Ewing. Thank you to our producers, Dr. Gerald Horne, Sister Flora, Sister Femi, Brother Brandon. Thank you to our board op, Wendell. Thank you, Mark Maxwell, and all those who made today's program possible. Coming up next is our sister Sumta with Spotlight Africa, addressing issues facing Mother Africa. And signing off for Freedom Now, this is Sister Thage. And until next week, as always, we stand ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.